All right. Welcome back. And so for this next video, I want to think about how economics informs the study of history. What is it that economic historians think the study of economics can really do to transform our understanding of history? And there's really a few main things that economists think can contribute to our understanding of history. So we can use our models, our economic modeling, to help interpret historical phenomena, right? We can also bring an economist's sense of quantification to historical data, so different ways of measuring, different ways of thinking about, transforming things like written texts into something that's usable data for testing hypotheses, which leads to the next thing we can offer. We have a full battery of statistical methods to systematically and rigorously test hypotheses, right? So this is the whole point of that quantification. We can put forward one theory of why the world unfolded the way it did. But for us to believe that theory relative to another, we'd like to have some way to statistically test which of these is the more plausible state of the world. And to do that, we need our statistical tools, we need our quantification. So finally, if we can use economic theory to help interpret historical phenomena, if we can use quantification of historical data and statistical modeling, statistical testing to think about what theories of the evolution of the world historically hold up and don't hold up, right? Well, then we move closer to having ways to extrapolate from history to the modern world, right? We're going to be able to use historical data, historical evidence, historical events to predict how things are going to unfold in the future if we've been able to sort of test and refine the models, right? That's what allows us to extrapolate from history. Okay? So we have our common phrase that history repeats itself, right? Well, we want to know how it's going to repeat itself under a different set of conditions. And for that, we need these models. We need these ways of rigorously testing those models. So there's no better way to think about this contribution of economics to history than to think about the first economics Nobel laureate who really won for economic history. So this is Bob Fogle right here. He shared the Nobel Prize with Doug North, another economic historian, and we're going to be looking at his work a little bit later in the next video. But what Bob Fogle did is he came around, he was one of these leading cliometricians, and he said, we've been wrong about how we've been thinking about history, and I've got the economic models and the data to prove it. So the first way he did this with his PhD dissertation is he waded into this fight about how important railroads were to American economic growth. Okay? So here's a map of rates of travel in 1800, before we connected up the country with railroads. So this is all relative to starting out in New York City. And so you can see that we can get down to the Middle Peninsula here in Virginia in about 4 to 5 days, right? It takes us about 2 weeks to get to Charlottesville, right? If we want to head out to the Midwest, we're talking on the order of a month, right? So if it takes a month to get to the Midwest, this is not going to be a particularly well-integrated economy in terms of the different regions. So along come railroads, and this fundamentally changes transportation in the United States, right? And so if we look at rates of travel by railroad, so we're not talking about airplanes here, by 1930, right? Now the entire country is connected in no more than, say, 3 days travel time. Okay? The entire East Coast is now less than a day's worth of travel time, and the Midwest to New York City is now a day or two, depending on where you are, right? So what does this mean for the economy? It means amazing things for the economy. Right? So we're now going to have an integrated economy. We can now specialize in different regions, take advantage of comparative advantage, realize all these gains from trade. We can grow our food in the Midwest. We can, produce our manufactured goods in the East, and we're going to have much larger economy, much greater GDP, higher income per capita, more consumption for everybody. Just a lovely new world in the 20th century here, right? And so all this was made possible by railroads, or at least this is what people said. So if you look at the history, it looks obvious, right? We're a series of sort of disconnected small regional economies in 1800, and overall output for the country is not that spectacular. Railroads integrate all those economies, and now we have a huge booming economy with lots of commerce over those rail lines. So for all intents and purposes, if you look at the world, it looked like railroads made a huge difference. So why is Fogle going to question it, right? Well, he's going to bring in this economist notion of the counterfactual, right? He's going to say, we can't think of railroads relative to what 1800 looked like, right? That's not the right comparison to make, to say were railroads fundamental to American economic growth. What we want to think about is, what would the country look like in 1930 had we never had railroads, right? The country's not going to stay looking like 1800. It's going to look fundamentally different. And so what he does is he says, well, if we didn't have railroads, we were also pretty good at transporting stuff over canals. And so he's going to write down a model of what would the optimal canals to build be if you didn't have railroads. And that's what this map from his dissertation is showing. So he figured out sort of the lowest cost, most efficient way to map out new canals. Can't really get past the Rocky Mountains with your canals here, right? But he shows there's a very economical way to link up the entire Midwest and the East with this canal system. And if you use that canal system, this sort of theoretical canal system that he arose at using economic modeling and economic theory, right? Well, the country still expands massively. You still have a very integrated economy, right? It's not quite what it would have been with railroads, but it's not chump change, right? It's still massive economic growth. And so were railroads fundamental to economic growth? The answer Fogle comes up with is no, not really, right? Other things would have developed in their absence. So it's great that we had railroads, but you can't say that railroads are this one crucial ingredient, even though that's what it looks like, because that was the one way we saw history play out, okay? Why do we care about this? Well, think about going into another developing country and you say, look, I want to use the history of the US here. What you guys need to do is just expand your railroads like crazy, and then you're going to have tremendous economic growth, right? That's not going to work, right? We can't just blindly apply one historical event to another setting, right? We need to kind of model it, understand how it could have played out differently, understand what the alternatives were. That's going to give us a far more nuanced way to inform policy in a different country in a different time period. Right. So the other thing that I sort of focused on with thinking about how economics can inform history is this notion of quantification. All right. So as much as Karl Breidenball was not too pleased with the cliometric revolution, as I showed you in the last video, other historians equally displeased with us. So here's a particularly famous historian, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., quoted in 1962. Right? You can see there he's Times Man of the Year. Right? But this is his take on this notion of quantification. The mystique of empirical social research, in short, leads its acolytes to accept as significant only the questions to which quantitative magic can provide answers. As a humanist, I am bound to reply almost all important questions are important precisely because they are not susceptible to quantitative answers. All right. So as a social scientist, I am bound to reply that that's phooey. Okay. So one thing that the cliometric revolution did was it showed that things we didn't think could be quantified, if we were clever enough, we could quantify them. And then we could actually learn sort of much deeper things about why the world worked the way it did. So this is also another Bob Fogle moment. The other claim to fame for Bob Fogle was his work on slavery, this book called Time on the Cross. So when he publishes this book, this is an attempt to understand how critical slavery was to the Southern economy in the antebellum era, right? But to do it using lots of economic modeling and lots of quantification. And as a result, he received a lot of pushback on this book, right? So these are the types of questions that a humanist like Schlesinger says that quantitative magic can't be applied, right? We can't apply this to this horrible institution of slavery. But when cliometricians decided to try to use those tools to get a better understanding, we learned new things. So one example of the type of work that Fogle was doing, work that would be kept up by other economic historians, is in using things like height to quantify the standard of living, to understand the living conditions of slaves relative to free laborers in the antebellum era. So here's some data from a paper by Rick Steckel back from the 1980s that shows how using this height data to quantify standard of living gave us a very different understanding of how the slave economy worked. So what you're looking at is age on the horizontal axis, and you're looking at the heights of slaves relative to the modern height distribution for those given ages on the vertical axis. So if we look at 5-year-olds right here, you can see that for both males and females, they're in that bottom 1 percentile of the modern height distribution, right? So that leads us to think that there was really poor nutrition, really poor living standards for these male and female slaves. What happens, though, in the teenage years is something remarkable that Steckel documents. So right around 14 and a half, we see the heights of females rise dramatically. Right around 16 and a half, we see the heights of males rise dramatically, to the point where they're now up closer to the 25th percentile or even the 30th percentile of the modern height distribution. So there's some huge change in their standard of living, right? And so this catch-up growth, as it's called, Steckel shows that this is basically tied to how slave owners treated their slaves. And when these slaves became viable workers on the plantations, the slave owners would change their diets, change their living conditions in ways that led to these dramatic improvements in health, but ways that were sort of really awfully tied to the profitability of the plantation. So it's a really sort of depressing but fascinating result that Steckel comes up with, right? And that gave us this much deeper understanding of how slave owners were treating their slaves, how brutally sort of economically calculating those slave owners were in ways that we didn't get just from reading standard accounts of slavery, sort of just the historiography of slavery. And that's how this quantification can really give us new insights into how history took place. So one last thing on the idea of economics contributing to history is another application of theory. So another strand of this cliometrics, another strand of modern economic history, has been about taking things like the game theory tools developed by economists and using those to understand how things played out between different trading partners in different countries in historical times. So what you're seeing here, old map of Northern Africa and the Mediterranean, right? And the reason I'm showing you this map is because this is actually the trading region of the Maghrebi traders back in the Middle Ages. And so this was a trading coalition that had traders all over the Mediterranean ports. And at this time, you don't necessarily have strong states, any sort of sense of international rules and laws, or any real protections of the court to protect your trade interests. And so there's huge benefits to be had for everybody if we can figure out how to trade over long distances. We don't have the modern day protections that allow us to do that. So what an economist, Avner Greif, showed was that this particular traders coalition came up with a really elegant set of self-enforcing rules for how trade would take place. Essentially what happened was they would have agents in different cities, and these agents would trade with other people in the network. If your agent ever cheated you, right, then the rest of the network would say, we'll never trade with that agent again. So that punishment, the threat of that punishment was big enough that those agents wouldn't cheat you. Okay? And so it's this really elegant solution to a world where we don't have modern courts and modern contracts. And Greif does all kinds of amazing historical work going through all the letters between these traders and showing when different agents were shunned and showing where the trade was taking place and how they crafted these agreements, and then shows that all those agreements actually line up with our game theory, right, to give us this really cool understanding of how the world functioned without our modern legal system. All right, so up next, we're going to think about the other direction, how we're going to become much better economists by taking history seriously. So that's for the next video.